Chapter 2. Budding Flowers. I was 7 years old when my parents decided that the time had come for me to go to school. Living in the country, there was not really a great deal of choice for a girl like me, and they quickly decided that I should begin my education at a nearby convent, St. Audrey's. I remember very little about my first day there, except for a sense of terror when I first saw the nuns. Everything about them seemed to make a noise. Some had strange creaks that came from underneath their habits, and they all had long strings of beads that rattled against each other whenever they moved. Sister Ruth was my favourite nun. Oh, she was awfully nice. She used to call the register in the morning, and if anyone was missing, she was very friendly. She would say sweetly, "Where is Sally today?" "Never. Where's that truant Sally, then?" like Mother Roger, the Mother Superior. I also liked Sister Ruth because of the interest she took in my music. Of course, all the nuns knew that Mother had been a singer, but some of them disapproved. Sister Ruth took a great interest, however, and whenever she met my mother at open days, she would ask, "Do you think we're doing the right thing for Hilda musically?" And Mother always said she was certain they were doing the best they could. Our school day used to start at 7:30. At least it should have done, but I hated getting up. So Nanny usually had to come up and drag off the bedclothes before I got washed and dressed. We travelled to school in a pony and trap driven by Mr. Soames, who used to come up from the village to collect us every morning at 8:15. We used to hear the trap rattling up the drive and crunching through the gravel just as we were finishing the last mouthfuls of our breakfast. Then there would be a fearful rush down the stairs from the nursery and out the front door to see who could be in the trap first. I usually beat Elspeth as I was bigger, but I frequently forgot my satchel, which meant climbing all the way back up the top of the house to fetch it. The way to school passed through Bracket Basing, and every morning Miss Prout from the post office used to wave to us from the doorway. I think she must have had a soft spot for Mr. Soames, because he often stopped off there to buy his tobacco, and when he came out, he usually had a stick of barley sugar or a stick of licorice for each of us. Of course, we were not supposed to eat this until after school, but I used to start mine straight away, although it was difficult to conceal the black smudges around my mouth. St. Audrey's had been built originally as a large Georgian farmhouse, which made it ideally suited as a school. In those days, everything was taught from the blackboard, and I do not remember having very many textbooks. Our blackboard stood on a large frame of polished pine, which had 3 pegs to match, even though only 2 of the pegs were needed to hold it up. Apart from music, which was looked on more as a way of life at St. Audrey's than a school lesson, the only subjects we were taught were English, history, geography, needlework, and what we would call domestic science today. I found the first 3 subjects easy, especially English, but needlework was always a headache. I could manage to sew, but I was never brilliant at it, and I certainly did not enjoy it as much as many of the other girls, especially Elspeth. Our domestic science classes were very unimaginative. The one that sticks most firmly in my memory is the day we made potato soup. We were all told to bring a jug to school so that we could each take some of the soup home after we'd made it. One girl brought a milk bottle, which, being made of glass, cracked as soon as the hot soup was poured into it, scattering soup and broken glass all over the place. The poor boarders were supposed to be having the soup that night, because Reverend Cook was having a night off, but they went hungry. As soon as I got home, Mother said, "Well, we're not going to drink that, are we?" and promptly poured it all down the sink. The most enjoyable part of the convent was playing rounders. I really felt that I had an instrument in my hand whenever I was batting. Oh, yes. I did not like having the ball thrown at me, and that might have been why I was so good at hitting it. But whenever I made contact with my bat, the ball seemed to go for miles, and everyone wanted Hilda Bracket to play on their side. Hockey and lacrosse were never favourite games of mine. They both seemed rather dangerous. Now, Evadne used to adore lacrosse, though in fact she still has a lacrosse stick on the back of her bedroom door at Stackton Trestle. It bangs every time she goes in or comes out. The best kind of playing took place during the breaks between lessons. In the summer, we used to rush into the big field that lay behind the convent and always smelt of newly mown hay in June. When the stooks were still in the field, we played hide-and-seek in and out of them, and then we would spend all the next lesson picking grass out of our clothes and hair. I frequently spent all my lessons sitting at the back of the classroom looking at that field in a lovely daydream. The school day finished at 3:30, and, if we had been good, at 3:00. We were given stars to stick in our books if we had done well in the lessons, and depending on how many stars we had collected, we were allowed to finish school half an hour early, or we had to do an extra half an hour's work. Mr. Soames used to collect Elspeth and me at 3:30, which meant we were usually home by 4:00. Between then and tea time, we were allowed to do whatever we wanted. We used to climb trees or help Mother if she was arranging flowers, but my favourite occupation was finding Pepper and seeing what he was up to. I always enjoyed helping him in the garden, especially when he was using his dibber. Pepper used to stand with his dibber in his hand, making holes in the freshly dug earth, and I used to drop the seeds into the holes before he covered them over. He never minded me helping him. In fact, he used to say, "Well, Miss Hilda, you can only learn by watching and listening." And in many cases, he was absolutely right. I have always preferred being practical, probably because I love being involved with things. At school, I always wanted to be singled out to sing a solo or demonstrate a dance, but I hated being asked the question in front of the others. Although I used to daydream and frequently had to stand in the corner as a punishment, I found that many of the other girls were jealous of me. I had one friend at school called Rupert, who always made Gil very envious when he came to play with us during the holidays. Rupert used to bring me presents and flowers that he picked from the garden, which made me awfully happy, which infuriated Gil, who thought that Rupert was trying to come between the two of us. Of course he was quite wrong. After all, we were just children. I remember one occasion when Rupert was terribly sweet to me. I'd lost my badge somewhere, and he gave me his so I would not get into trouble, although he knew he would be punished himself. Our badges were like metal brooches and were attached to our hats by safety pins. The nuns were very strict about our appearance, and anyone appearing without their badge used to be told off very sternly, especially if they were frequently in trouble, as I used to be. However, on this occasion, Rupert noticed that my badge had been taken and quickly gave me his before I was found out. I don't think I really thanked him properly for doing that. He certainly seemed to expect something from me after that, anyway. Unfortunately, the only person from St. Audrey's with whom I ever kept up afterwards was Miss O'Toole, who taught us elocution. She was, well, slightly eccentric, but terribly sweet, and came every Tuesday and Thursday mornings. Before the lesson started, she would walk slowly around the room, enunciating and breathing very deeply. She used to tell us, "The only way to speak correctly is to enunciate perfectly and breathe deeply." Whenever she wanted to emphasize something dramatically, Miss O'Toole would walk over to the vase of flowers that we always brought her. In complete silence, she would pick out one of the flowers, turn to the class, and then repeat loudly and clearly what she'd just said while putting the flower in one of her buttonholes. I say one buttonhole because she always wore dresses that buttoned from the neck right down to her ankles, which were considered very old-fashioned even then. If the lesson had been particularly important, there would be several flowers attached to her dress at the end, and by the time we all went to lunch, she would be covered with a line of wilting flowers stretching all the way down the front of her dress, which made her look rather like a collapsed flower stall at a garden fete, especially as she was very amply proportioned. She was able to advise me on developing my voice, and we used to write to each other quite regularly until I went away to Italy. But I never heard from her again, and when I inquired at St. Audrey's, they were rather guarded in disclosing her whereabouts. All they said was, she had chosen to develop her interest in flowers at the expense of her teaching, which I took as a polite way of saying that she'd gone round the bend. By the time I left St. Audrey's at the age of 12 to go to Sandaldine, Gil had already gone to Harrow. Oh, I can still remember the day he left as clearly as if it were yesterday. Mother came too. It was a lovely autumn day. Pepper and Cork carried his new trunk down to the car, and Gil came out wearing his uniform for the first time, looking very smart and rather smaller than usual. Mother had wisely bought his clothes with the idea that he would grow into them, which he did several years later. He did not seem the least perturbed himself, but Mother was awfully upset as Father drove him away down the drive. We soon cheered up there when he began to bring friends home for the holidays. One of these, Sebastian, was the son of an earl. Oh, he was terribly sweet to me when I was about 15, and kept wanting me to go for a walk with him in the grounds. I used to take him round Pepper's kitchen garden, but he didn't seem very interested in that, which was very strange. He always wanted to go into the maze, but I told him, "Well, you can go in if you like, but I know it inside out," and he stopped coming after that. Gil did help him out in the end. I've often wondered if I should have helped him, but there was something that stopped me going in there. My parents had chosen Sandaldine for me after discussing schools with other parents. Lots of well-known girls from very good families had been educated there, and of course it had always been famous for turning out such accomplished girls. Elspeth came with me that first time, though I think she was even more frightened than I was, and just as I was saying goodbye to them all, she pushed her little teddy bear into my hand to help keep me company. I had decided that the way to overcome the trepidation I was feeling was to look upon my arrival as that of a famous actress, and that is really how I played my first day at school. I had not long set foot inside the school, though, when I met Flavia Checketts, and we hit it off immediately, becoming chums from the word go. She and I were terrors at Sandaldine. We were always going off together. We used to go for long walks and could never be found when anybody wanted us. We used to talk and talk about our homes and our families. Boyfriends never raised their heads. Flavia was a charming girl and very talented in some respect. She always knitted her own twin sets. We used to have midnight feasts in the dorm, and Flavia and I always had much more to eat than any of the others. After the holidays we always had a little extra money and nearly a full tuck box. I had a bookcase in my room with very deep shelves, and I found that if I kept the books right at the front, there was enough space behind them to hide little tins of fruit and other delicacies. If Mother had found out, she would have been even angrier than the house mistress. Mother always used to say, "Nothing out of a tin, Hilda." But I used to get so hungry sometimes that I was very grateful for my little store. I know on the day I left, I was halfway down the drive for the last time when I realized I'd forgotten a little tin of strawberries. I very nearly went back to fetch them, but in the end I didn't. I suppose they might still be there. Though I had to knuckle down to the usual humdrum school subjects, just like all the others, there were school plays as compensation, and I still pride myself that some of my most moving performances were given before the appreciative audiences at Sandaldine. My Falstaff was a particular favourite, and I like to think that my performance might have contributed in some small way to the decision never to perform another of Shakespeare's history plays again during my time in the school. Well, they realised that the role could never be played in quite that way by anyone but me. My mother said to me after the performance, "Hilda, dear, if Shakespeare had been alive, he'd have turned in his grave." I felt very pleased. I had taken special care over my makeup. I copied a portrait at home of my great-great-great-grandfather, Matthew Bracket, and when I made my first entry, there was an audible gasp in the audience. Matthew Bracket had been a most unusual-looking man. My chief regret was that there was no song for Falstaff, but I succeeded in slipping in a few snatches of bawdy song here and there, which were completely unrehearsed, but which had a tremendous impact on the audience. The strange thing was that so few of the staff seemed as pleased with my performance as the other girls. Miss Brinks, in particular, was distinctly cold to me after the curtain had come down for the last time. She was in charge of the lighting for Henry IV when I played Falstaff, but when she arrived for the dress rehearsal, we'd no idea what had happened to her, nor, I suspect, had she. For some reason, she was dressed in trousers, a green corduroy jacket, full makeup, and no hairnet. I've never liked women in trousers, except in trouser roles in some plays. But the sight of Miss Brinks climbing up a ladder to a lighting box on that occasion was one of the most frightening things I have ever seen. Flavia was very charitable and said that perhaps Miss Brinks was a frustrated actress, but I felt there was far more to it than that. Of course, I sang in the school choir throughout my time at Sandaldine, under the careful direction of the choir mistress, Mrs. Gint. She had great spirit. Her husband died during my second year at school, and the whole choir went to sing at his funeral. Unfortunately, the organ was out of order, and poor Mrs. Gint had to accompany us on an old harmonium wheeled to the front of the altar rails. This harmonium could not have been used for years because it was covered in dust. One of the bellows had a leak which made it squeak. So, all the way through the first hymn, there was this awful squeaking sound accompanying the sombre dirge. Flavia nudged me during the second verse, and by the time we started on the last but one, we were both having fits of the giggles, when suddenly Mrs. Gint stopped playing and looked up at us to say, "Oh, I do wish poor Edward was here to hear this. How it would make him laugh." I suppose I became something of a star in the choir, but none of the other girls seemed to mind, though I think my powers of organisation, which I inherited from father, helped to smooth over any differences between us. Unlike most of my contemporaries, I was not very fashion-conscious, or certainly far less so than I am today. The only tradition I did enjoy was that of dressing for dinner, which I've always liked, as I think it's a compliment to one's host. I know it's an old-fashioned idea today, but I still think that it is rather nice. I was really introduced to this practice while I was at Sandaldine, when I began to go out in the evenings for the first time with my parents during the school holidays. On very special occasions, we would go to London to see a show and have dinner in town afterwards. I remember going to see Bittersweet with Evelyn Leigh. Oh, she looked so beautiful, with all that golden hair and in those gorgeous costumes. She was a great influence on me, because I played Sari Linden, the 17-year-old ingenue role, later. On these occasions when we went to town, we used to stay with father's relations, which added to the sense of occasion, although as far as I was concerned, the theatre was always the high spot of any visit to London. The curtain did not even need to go up. I was excited at simply setting foot inside the building. Once I was in my seat, looking at the proscenium arch, and waiting for the lovely velvet drapes to swish back, revealing a fabulous set, I was in a trance. It was like being in another world. I was not conscious of anyone else around me until the curtain fell. That is the way I've always seen it, and all my impressions of the theatre came from those early years. They've stayed with me, and over the years have helped me to create and sustain all my different roles. That sense of magic and power of imagination are two of my most fortunate gifts. The cinema was just coming into its own during my adolescence. I remember seeing a couple of early silent films with Mary Pickford, who I used to think was terribly pretty. The trouble was that even then we laughed at the way they walked so quickly on the screen, knowing that nobody really walked like that. The only thing I did not like about the cinema, however, was sitting in the dark during the afternoon. I did not like going into the dark to watch something when it was a lovely day outside. But that was as a result of coming from the country, I suppose. I think it is terrible that television today has killed off absolutely everything, including conversation. Dr. Hinge and I do not have a television, of course. We are great fans of the wireless, though there again they've taken away some of our favourite programmes. I still miss the Dales, I worry even now about Mags and Monument. I'm sure nobody does about characters on the television once they've gone. However, my nephew Julian has a nice big coloured one. We visit him once a month for a change to have a look at it, but I don't miss it really, although it's very nice at the time. But when you get to our age, too much of it is bad for your eyes. I was far more fascinated by pictures of a different kind, however, and although I will never be famous for my painting, it has been a hobby of mine since my days at Sandaldine. Of course, I saw all the great galleries in Italy while I was studying there, but in spite of seeing all the wonderful works of the Renaissance, I still prefer Constable's paintings. I adore his countryside, because it reminds me so much of my memories from childhood. Of course, adolescence for every girl is the time when she feels the first flutterings of love, but being away at Sandaldine, it was more like a formal trial flight as far as we were concerned. We used to attend dances with boys during the holidays, and sometimes during the term, and then it was terribly important to go with someone other than your own brother. Most of us liked our brothers very much, but if you went with your brother, people invariably thought you could not find anybody else. In the same way, brothers did not want to be seen with their sisters because it was sloppy. Gil and I used to practice dancing in the main hall at Bracket Towers, and of course he had had dancing lessons at Harrow, just as I had them at Sandaldine. But when it came to the actual dances we attended, we only went semi-chaperoned. I went to one with my mother, where she and all the other mothers sat in another room behind the curtained window, looking onto the dance floor. Having been at Sandaldine 4.5 years, I scraped through my school certificate, which meant that the most important part of my education had been completed, and in other respects I had outgrown school life. I realised that compared with most girls of 16.5 today, I was very innocent indeed. However, we did have to grow up, and one of the ways of doing this was by going to a finishing school in Europe. When the day finally came to leave Sandaldine, I was sorry to be leaving all my friends, and we vowed to keep in touch always. We all cried when we parted, and even though I thought I was terribly sophisticated going to Europe for a year, there was still something of the schoolgirl in me as we drove away from Sandaldine for the last time, and I suddenly remembered my tin of strawberries in the bookcase. When the day eventually came for me to leave for my Swiss finishing school, I asked my parents if I could travel all the way to London on my own, and to my amazement they agreed. Gil had gone to Trinity by now, so he was still on vacation when I went away. My mother's maid, Alice, cook, and the other servants all came to see me off, and dear Pepper presented me with a posy which he had just picked for me. Then the family drove me down to Bracket Basing, where I caught the train to London. My mother whispered a few last-minute warnings about continental men into my ear, but I was far too excited and too innocent to take anything in. I was still waving frantically as the train went into a tunnel, and I was covered in smoke. I spent the night with father's relations in Belgravia, before catching the Golden Arrow to Paris the next morning. The Channel crossing was fortunately quite smooth, although not smooth enough for another girl I met hanging over the deck rail, Heather Grinling, who I discovered was also going to Schloss Auerbruck. Heather recovered once we were on the train again, travelling towards Paris, and she even felt strong enough to accept a drink offered to us by a strange man sitting in our compartment. The train had stopped at Amiens for a few minutes, and a lot of people had got out onto the platform to buy papers or magazines from the stalls, while others were leaning out of the carriage windows trying to attract the attention of the boys who were walking up and down the platform like cinema usherettes, selling chocolate and bread rolls, shouting, "Buffet! Buffet!" I had started to feel a little peckish, which the man opposite me must have seen, because he suddenly said in a very gruff voice, "Hallo? Schnapps?" I said, "Oh no, we don't have a camera." But he did not seem to understand, and just repeated, "Hallo? Schnapps?" And to make himself absolutely clear, he felt in his coat and pulled out a large bottle of liquid. We all became very jolly after that. Heather soon forgot about her earlier troubles, and I certainly found my extra sea legs leaping about as the train rattled across northern France. This kind man found us a taxi at the Gare du Nord when we arrived in Paris, and shortly afterwards we were once again en route for Bâle, where we were met and taken to the Schloss. There were only about 40 girls at the Schloss Auerbruck for the year that I was there, and most of them were continental. We were supposed to speak French at all times, which at least put the English girls like me on an equal footing with the girls from Germany and Scandinavia. I realised right from the very first breakfast that finishing school was going to be very different from Sandaldine and St Audrey's. For one thing, we sat at separate tables, with no more than 4 of us to a table. There were maids to wait on us and bring us our food, and the food itself was extremely good. I had 7 croissants that first morning. I was so hungry and excited. Heather and I had arrived at the weekend, which allowed us a couple of days to settle in before the term started properly the following Monday morning. This gave us the opportunity to explore the castle and its grounds, which I was terribly keen to do. The first thing I did after breakfast, petit déjeuner, was to go down to the lake by a steep path through the pine trees. It was on the way back up, as I was pausing to take a breath, that I saw the Schloss standing high above the trees for the first time. It was built of grey stone, and stood on a promontory of rock commanding the highest position for several miles. It was built in the same style as the castle of mad King Ludwig of Neuschwanstein in Bavaria, and it had a fairy tale quality that made me feel I was taking part in a wonderful production with a life-size stage set. I think it was at that moment, as I stared up at the turrets and pinnacles that seemed to scrape the very sky itself, that I decided that, come what may, I was going to do my utmost to become a singer and an actress. Finishing school was far more suited to my temperament than normal school, and I quickly settled into the more relaxed, carefree life. The only member of the staff that I remember at all clearly was an Englishwoman, strangely enough, and strange was certainly the right word in her case. Her name was Miss Silt, and there used to be so much embarrassment when any of the girls got the letters the wrong way round. I've often thought that if I moved as she did, I would not have got where I am today. She was very, tweedy in appearance, and I always felt she looked as if she was going off for a day's rough shooting rather than taking a class in deportment. Miss Silt had a very deep voice, and in some ways was very reminiscent of a principal boy of the worst kind. She was quite unlike our lovely Dorothy Ward, who was absolutely beautiful and had the loveliest legs in the business. Apart from the deportment classes with Miss Silt, I really threw myself into the life at the Schloss. I used to get up every morning and wash in cold water because it was so refreshing and so good for the skin. I have never worn a lot of makeup, even on stage, and I am sure it is due mainly to washing in cold water always. I used to believe if you held your feet in the right position, your face would then follow, and your voice would do the rest. I have followed that maxim right through my career, and it has never failed me. After my wash, I would do a few arm stretching and leg and toe touching exercises at the open window. This was not because I was a health fanatic or anything like that. It was simply that I had become used to doing exercises at home in order to get warm when I got out of bed first thing in the morning. And nowadays, I think people have gone too far with all this jogging, which is very silly. A lot of people do it far too often. It makes them ill. The last thing I did at the window before getting dressed was to sing a few scales just to get my voice going properly before the day began, which I still do today. Many people have commented on it in Stacked and Trestle. Much of the teaching at my finishing school was concerned with introducing us to the social graces that would make us young ladies. There were certain familiar subjects like French conversation and needlework, but there were new ones like deportment, flower arranging, household management, and personal appearance. Sometimes 2 of us would give a tea party for a few of the others, and 1 member of staff. We had to arrange all the food for the party, make sure that all the correct silver and crockery had been laid out, and then act as perfect hostesses when the guests arrived. It may seem rather silly now, but the lessons that we learnt at those tea gatherings proved invaluable to me in later life. We learnt the correct manner of greeting everyone, from a costermonger to a cardinal. We learnt how to react when speaking to the Countess of so-and-so, or the Dowager Duchess of whatnot, and we were even taught the correct manner of conducting ourselves at a funeral. Well, that is someone else's funeral. We had much more freedom to go out at the Schloss than I had ever known at Sandaldine. At weekends, a group of us used to take the char-a-banc into Bâle to buy chocolates and look at the shops. This was a terrific thrill, because until then, our parents had always been responsible for buying us our clothes and things such as soap and talc. And now we had complete freedom of choice. We could spend our money on whatever we liked. I suppose because I was so tied up with my own ideas and dreams for my future stage career, it never occurred to me that some of the other girls might have found life in a Schloss just a little bit dull. But there was one who obviously did. Rebecca Quick. She was a big, friendly girl, good at sport, open-hearted, and willing to give of herself, which she did apparently very often. Even though the Schloss was far more relaxed than any normal school, there was one rule that the staff were very strict about: the admission of men. Apparently, Rebecca had been out on a little expedition one afternoon when she met this young man whose name was Heinz. His father worked on the trolley buses. Rebecca and he got on awfully well together, and I think in complete innocence she invited him back to the Schloss the following afternoon for tea. She also asked Heather and me as well as a couple of other girls, so poor Heinz was rather outnumbered, but he did not seem to mind. The tea party itself was remarkably uneventful, partly because Heinz could speak very little French, and none of us knew any German. But he and Rebecca managed to communicate somehow, and they left us to clear away the tea things while they went off for a walk. The first thing we knew that anything was amiss was the sight of Heinz being led out of the main gate without his Tyrolean hat and his little cross braces, closely followed by Rebecca carrying a hold-all. After that, the char-a-banc trips were scrutinized far more carefully, and the main gates were kept closed, so that anyone coming into the Schloss had to ring a bell to be admitted. I thought at the time that Rebecca was very silly, wasting the wonderful opportunity that being at the Schloss presented, particularly missing the music lessons given by the Viennese maestro Herr Lumbecker, who was a wonderfully kind man and a marvellous teacher. I was perpetually bubbling over with enthusiasm, and I am sure he must have spent half our lessons getting me to settle down and relax. He had wonderful technique himself, but he also possessed that special knack of imparting his skill to others. He could be very strict at times, which was certainly no bad thing as far as I was concerned, and he instilled in me the essential disciplines that any singer must acquire. For all my girlish faults, though, I think I must have inspired him in some way. I could sense a change in his mood as soon as I entered the room after he had finished the lesson with one of the other girls. I'm probably flattering myself, but I used to feel sometimes that he looked on me as a fellow professional rather than a silly girl who wanted to sing sweetly to impress some equally silly boy. However, there are some things in life that are almost too perfect to last, and sadly, the tuition with Herr Lumbecker was one of these. His death came as a terrible shock to me, and I felt it almost as keenly as the death of any of my beloved ones in later years. We were never told of the full circumstances, but his passion for bathing obviously got the better of him, and I am sure that he only drank the bottle of brandy to warm himself after that midnight dip. A lot of the girls thought he was silly to go swimming from the end of the boat jetty fully clothed, but to my way of thinking, it was very sensible in February when it was so cold a night. The staff were very considerate to me at the Schloss after my teacher's death, and did everything they could to assist my musical career. One of the staff knew of a certain Signor Ernesto Bonavoce, whose family originated from Leeds. He was now working somewhere in Italy, and attempts were made to arrange an introduction for me to his school. This was terribly exciting, but I was determined not to tell anyone at home until I definitely knew that I had been accepted. So I carried on writing as usual, as if everything were the same. I'd waited for over 5 weeks for the answer, which came eventually in Italian, so I had to ask one of the Italian girls to translate it for me. Though she could not translate all of it into English, she was able to tell me that Signor Bonarovoce would be happy to receive me at his school at the beginning of the next term. That was all I needed to know. I was over the moon with happiness. I still had to tell my parents, of course, and there was no guarantee that they would agree to my plans. I decided that it would be better to tell them face to face, and as the time at the Schloss came to an end, I could not wait to get home. When I got home, my reception back into the bosom of the family was rather eclipsed by my coming-out ball 10 days later. It was a time of great tension for me. I was naturally terribly excited about all the plans and preparations that were going on around me, but at the same time I was very apprehensive about telling my parents about going to Italy. I had to battle with myself to conceal my feelings, and I think most people thought that I was getting worked up about the coming out. Mother had arranged for me to have a lovely dress made entirely of silk in one of my favourite colours, cyclamen pink. She lent me her pearls for the evening, and Father gave me a beautiful emerald and pearl brooch, which I still wear, but only on very special occasions. Father got very upset when he gave me the brooch and said, "It doesn't seem longer than a few months ago when you were just a child, and now—" But he did not finish what he was saying, and went off to his room for an hour or so before the ball started. The banisters and stairs were festooned with flowers and garlands that Pepper had grown for the occasion, and as I came down, the orchestra was playing in the drawing-room. It was strangely quiet, however, because not one of the 200 guests said a word. They were standing at the foot of the stairs looking up and smiling. Oh, it was a wonderful feeling, but an awful entrance to have to make. Far worse than anything I have ever had to do on stage. Gil led me straight onto the dance floor, and we led off the dancing. Father danced with Mother, and as I whirled around, I could see all my friends, many of whom I had not seen since I'd got back from Switzerland. Flavia was there, looking lovely in a dress of peacock blue that matched her eyes. Heather had come, of course, though I did not like her dress very much. Black never suited her. I like black now because it is very dressy. I'm particularly fond of black and pearls, but they require a certain maturity to be carried off properly. The supper table looked magnificent. There was a boar's head with an apple in its mouth, which later on Gil insisted on trying to knock out with a billiard cue. It was rather silly of him, because it shot straight into a bowl of punch, and that went all over Father's boiled shirt front. Mother almost had the vapours because she thought he'd been stabbed, though I cannot imagine who would have wanted to stab Father. As it was really my night, everybody wanted to dance with me, and I seemed to have boundless energy, although I was always grateful when there was a break in the music for the musicians to have a rest. It was during one of these intervals that Anthony, the son of one of Father's army friends, asked if I would like a glass of something and a little fresh air. Well, I was in need of both, so we collected a glass of champagne each and went out through the French windows onto the first of the terraces. Anthony had been very friendly with Gil when they were boys, but he had gone into the colonial service when Gil went into the army. He had visited the tower several times, though I had never taken much notice of him. I was always far more intrigued by Gil's friends from school. We chatted pleasantly, enjoying the warm night air and the lights illuminating the fountain and pergola leading to the maze. It looked so inviting that Anthony and I refilled our glasses and then strolled down towards the maze. When we were out of earshot of the other guests, we sat down on the white garden seat to listen to a nightjar singing in the woods. While we were sitting there, he told me quite suddenly that he was going abroad in a fortnight's time. This came as a great shock to me, because I'd always imagined him as one of the permanent elements in the life of the Towers, even though he only came from time to time. Although I knew that I was soon going away myself, I could not imagine changes taking place at the Towers, or to the people who I associated with it. And for the only time in my life, I think I was at a loss for words. "You're not usually like this," he said. "Why can't you tell me what you feel?" "I don't know what to say," I replied. "Well, I've got an idea. I want to ask you something very special. It's not just a job I'm going away for. I want to start a life of my own, and it is an ideal opportunity for a married man." "But you're not married, Anthony," I told him. "No, I don't think you quite understand what I'm saying." And of course I did not. I'd no idea what he was actually proposing. "Would you like to come with me, Hilda?" he asked. But I said, "Oh, I can't go away just like that, Anthony. It's awfully kind of you to ask me, and at any other time I'd jump at the opportunity. But I've got my family and my home to consider. Besides, I'm going to Italy soon to study opera. I've got to sing, you see." He could not understand how much that meant to me, which was a pity. I remember we got up and walked back through the gardens in the silence. When we reached the terraces, the orchestra struck up again, beginning with a song of Ivan Novello's. "I've only to hear that tune today, and I see the lights in the garden on the night of my ball," and Anthony, of course. He went away, as he said, a fortnight later, and I've never seen him since. I never wore the dress again, not because I did not like it. It was the most beautiful dress that I had ever worn, but somehow it belonged to only one occasion. Once the ball was over, I was to be presented at court like every young girl in the country. I was madly in love with the handsome young king who had come to the throne only a few months before, and the prospect of being presented to him was as exciting as it was awe-inspiring. I was so concerned that I should look my best that I was mortified when I saw my white dress. It was so plain. But Mother told me sharply, "Beautiful girls don't need beautiful dresses." However, a cloud of disappointment descended when we arrived at the palace to be told that the king was indisposed and would be unable to attend the ceremony. I assumed that there would be no presentation at all, but we were very fortunate in being presented to the Duke and Duchess of York, who had stepped in to fill the breach, as they did in a very big way in December of that year. I remember seeing the Duchess for the first time in person when I entered the elegant chamber where the presentations were taking place. Oh, she was young and dark and terribly attractive. There seemed to be hundreds of girls passing in front of her, but she had a special smile for each of us. The Duke of York stood by her side, small, neat, and slightly nervous, I felt, but under the circumstances it was perfectly understandable, as we were soon to find out. Of course I was out of the country when the abdication crisis broke, but Mother wrote long letters to me telling me all about it. It came as a terrible shock to her, as it did to all of us. The abdication ended a chapter in my life, just as my coming out that summer had opened a new one. I think, like everyone in the nation and the empire, I realized that the great change which had taken place would mean that the monarchy was never to be the same again. But how many of us in those dark days of 1936 dreamt that it might grow into the stable and greatly loved institution it is today? I think the sense of anticlimax at the presentation spurred me on to break the news of my plans to my parents more rapidly than I had intended. This was such a crucial decision and such a vital step in my life that I was desperately in need of support and assistance, and not for the first time, I found a faithful ally in Gil. The day after we returned from London after my presentation, I broke the news to him in the conservatory. "Look, I've made up my mind, Gil. I've decided I am definitely going to Italy to study with Bonora Voce. I want to sing so much. Please help me to tell Mother and Father." He was strangely silent for a moment or two, but then he smiled and said, "Well, I shall miss you, but I'll stand by you, whatever they say. Between you and me, Mother will be all for it, and Father, if I know him, will be dead against it." So, the next day I came downstairs to breakfast, having steeled myself for the most difficult speech of my life. Father was tucking into his kidneys and bacon, reading the cricket column of the Times, and Mother was delicately toying with an omelette. I did not really want anything to eat, so I poured myself a cup of tea from the teapot on the sideboard and sat down. I was just plucking up courage to open my mouth when Gil, bless his heart, looked across and suddenly burst out, "Mother, Father, Hilda's got something to tell you." Of course, if I had been able to reach under the table, I would have kicked him, but it was so wide that I couldn't. They all turned to look at me, and almost in panic I said, "I've decided I'm going to Italy to study singing." You could have cut the silence with a knife. Finally, my father said quietly, "What about Anthony?" And I asked, "Anthony who, father?" I thought he was talking about Anthony Eden, who I'd never met. When Mother spoke, her voice was harder and more determined than I had ever heard it. "Hilda," she said, "I don't know what this wild scheme of yours is, or what you dreamed up. I don't know whether you've had a brainstorm or what it is, but the nearest you will ever get to Italy, my girl, is an ice cream parlour the next time we're in Sevenoaks." My hackles were raised by this, and I leant across the white tablecloth and said as forcefully as I could, "I'm sorry, but I'm going. I'm going to Italy." There was a long, awkward silence, and then quite unexpectedly, my father came to my defence and won the day. "Veronica, this girl is destined to sing," he said tenderly, taking my mother by the hand. "That is where her life is. That is what she wants to do. She feels that she must go. Of course the house won't be the same without her, but we can't expect the family to stay at home forever just to keep us happy." I think we were all taken aback by what father had said. It had certainly come as a great surprise to Gil and me, who were anticipating something very different. That was the end of the conversation at any rate. Mother quickly finished her coffee and hurried up to her room to lie down. Father took me to one side and said, "I shall miss you terribly, Hilda. You know that I have your mother and Elspeth and Gil. But you're the one I will miss most, because you're so alive. I shall miss hearing you sing in the house desperately. But when you become a famous singer, we'll all be able to come and hear you, and that will make up for all the disappointments." We went up to see Mother, and I explained to them about Signor Bernardo Bocce and the introduction that I had had to his school of music in Vicenza. I explained also how I intended finding a job to pay for my lessons, but my father cut across what I was saying and insisted that he would provide me with an adequate allowance. If I was going to learn to sing, he was not going to have me wasting valuable time washing dishes or acting as a housemaid. We were still talking about my plans when there was a tap at the door, and Gil came in with a tray, 4 glasses, and a bottle of champagne. He opened the bottle ceremoniously, and we all stood to drink a toast to the future. My future in Italy. The waiting in the wings was over. I had just been given my first cue.
There is a chord that echoes sweetly when it is spring and love is in the air. Whatever befall, respond to it completely, though it may bring you sadness and despair. Fling far behind you the chains that bind you, that love may find you in joy or strife, though fate may change